Iran just revealed something that could completely change the way we understand America's war against its nuclear program. For years, Washington has repeated one central argument. Whenever Iran comes up, Iran cannot be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. That has been the justification behind sanctions, diplomatic pressure, intelligence operations, military threats, and now open confrontation. But what if the biggest consequence of the war was not destroying Iran's nuclear ambitions? What if it changed Iran's calculation about whether it needs a nuclear weapon in the first place? Because that is the question nobody can afford to ignore. And if you look closely at what Iranian officials have been saying since the conflict began, a very different picture starts to emerge. This is no longer simply a story about uranium enrichment. It is becoming a story about survival, deterrence, and what happens when a country concludes that conventional defenses are not enough. And that brings us to the central question of this video. Was America's nuclear war actually creating the very incentive it was supposed to eliminate? Let's go back to the beginning. For decades, Iran has maintained that its nuclear program is primarily peaceful. Washington and its allies have never completely accepted that explanation. The concern has always been relatively simple. A country capable of producing highly enriched uranium, developing advanced centrifuges, maintaining sophisticated scientific infrastructure, and preserving the technical knowledge required for nuclear development could potentially move toward a weapon if its leadership made that decision. That possibility alone has been enough to make Iran one of the most closely watched countries in the world. But there was another factor that complicated the picture. Iran's leadership repeatedly emphasized that nuclear weapons were forbidden under its interpretation of Islamic law. The most important statement associated with that position came from Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was widely reported to have issued a religious ruling against nuclear weapons. Now, whether you believe that ruling was genuinely restraining Iran's nuclear ambitions or functioning partly as a diplomatic instrument is a completely different question. And this is where the story becomes complicated. Because the United States was not dealing with a country that simply had one switch labeled Nuclear and Nuclear 40 weapons, on or off. Iran had a massive political system surrounding the program. Scientists, military commanders, the Revolutionary Guard, parliament, security officials, diplomats, and, above all, a leadership structure capable of making the final strategic decision. For years, that system maintained what could be described as strategic ambiguity. Iran could develop the technological capability. It could preserve scientific knowledge. It could expand industrial infrastructure. But it could stop short of openly declaring that it had crossed the nuclear weapons threshold. That ambiguity gave Tehran something extremely valuable: options. And in geopolitics, options are power. Then the war changed the equation. The United States and Israel argued that military action was necessary to prevent Iran from reaching a dangerous nuclear capability. The logic was straightforward: destroy the infrastructure, damage the program, remove the threat, force Tehran to reconsider. But there's a problem with that strategy. A military attack does not only affect the target's physical infrastructure, it changes the target's perception of survival. Imagine you are sitting inside Iran's leadership. You watch what happened to countries that surrendered their unconventional weapons programs. You watch what happened to governments that depended on outside guarantees. And then you watch your own country get attacked, despite years of negotiations, inspections, sanctions, and diplomatic agreements. What conclusion do you draw? Perhaps you conclude that agreements are enough. Or perhaps you conclude the opposite. Perhaps you decide, we need a deterrent nobody can take away. That is the nuclear dilemma, and this is where Iran's recent statements become so important. According to the argument presented in the source material, senior Iranian officials have begun openly discussing whether the country's previous nuclear restrictions remain strategically sustainable. That does not automatically mean Iran has decided to build a nuclear weapon. It does not prove that Iran has a completed weapon, and it certainly does not mean a nuclear test is imminent. But it does reveal something potentially more important. The strategic calculation is changing, and that change may have been accelerated by the war itself. Think about the paradox. Washington says, we are attacking Iran because we do not want Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. Tehran can look at the same events and potentially reach a completely different conclusion. We were attacked because we did not have a nuclear deterrent. Those are two completely different interpretations of the same war. And they're two completely different futures. This is why the nuclear question cannot be separated from deterrence. Look at North Korea. Whatever your opinion of its government, its nuclear arsenal fundamentally changed how other countries calculate the cost of attacking it. That does not mean nuclear weapons make a country safe. They can create enormous risks. But they can also create what strategists call deterrence. The basic idea is terrifyingly simple. If attacking me could result in catastrophic retaliation, you may decide not to attack me in the first place. And that is precisely the lesson Iranian strategists could take from the conflict. For years, Iran invested heavily in missiles, drones, underground facilities, proxy networks, naval capabilities, and asymmetric warfare. But none of those capabilities provides the same psychological effect as a nuclear deterrent. And now the question is whether the war has strengthened the argument of those inside Iran who have always believed that the country needs one. This is where we need to slow down, because there is an important counter-argument. Maybe Iran's nuclear policy has not fundamentally changed. Maybe these statements are simply bargaining tactics. Maybe Tehran wants sanctions, relief, diplomatic leverage, and international recognition without actually crossing the nuclear threshold. That interpretation is entirely possible. In fact, Iran has spent decades using ambiguity as a strategic tool. So we should not automatically interpret every statement about nuclear deterrence as evidence that a bomb is being built. But even if that interpretation is correct, something has still changed. The incentive structure has changed, and that may be the most important development of all. Because before the war, the debate was largely about whether Iran wanted a nuclear weapon. After the war, the debate increasingly becomes, does Iran believe it needs one to survive? Those are not the same question. And if the answer to the second question becomes yes, then destroying individual facilities may not solve the underlying problem. You can destroy centrifuges. You can strike laboratories. You can damage enrichment facilities. You can eliminate commanders, but you cannot bomb an idea out of a country's strategic culture. If Iranian leaders conclude that nuclear capability is the ultimate insurance policy against regime change or future military intervention, then every attack could actually strengthen the political argument for acquiring that capability. And that brings us to what I call the nuclear boomerang. The policy designed to prevent nuclear proliferation could unintentionally make nuclear deterrence more attractive. The pressure intended to make Iran abandon the nuclear path could convince Iranian decision-makers that abandoning it is precisely what made them vulnerable. And if that is what Tehran has concluded, then the real consequences of this conflict may not appear tomorrow. They may appear months or years from now, because the most dangerous nuclear decisions are rarely made in a single afternoon. They begin with a change in calculation. A government starts asking a different question. Not, can we build a bomb? But can we afford not to? And that is the question we need to keep in mind as we move into the next part of this story, because Iran's nuclear calculation cannot be understood by looking at Iran alone. You also have to look at Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, Russia, China, and the United States, because every one of them is watching what happens next. And if one country in the Middle East decides that nuclear deterrence is the only reliable guarantee of survival, others may start asking themselves the exact same question. That is when a dispute over one nuclear program can become a regional nuclear race. And that is where the story gets much bigger. There is a reason the nuclear question surrounding Iran matters far beyond Tehran. Because Iran is not operating inside a vacuum, every major power in the Middle East is watching the same calculation unfold. And if Iran concludes that nuclear capability is the ultimate guarantee of survival, Saudi Arabia may be the next country asking the same question. Then Turkey could ask it. Then others. And suddenly, what began as an attempt to stop one country's nuclear ambitions could become the beginning of a much larger regional arms race. So let's zoom out. For years, Saudi Arabia has watched Iran's nuclear program with enormous concern. Riyadh and Tehran have competed for influence across the Middle East for decades. They have supported opposing political forces. They have backed competing regional networks, and they have fundamentally different visions of what the Middle East should look like. So imagine what happens if Iranian officials begin openly suggesting that nuclear deterrence is necessary for survival. Saudi Arabia doesn't need to build a bomb tomorrow. It only needs to believe that Iran might eventually build one. Because the moment that happens, the Saudi security calculation changes, and Saudi leaders have already made their position clear in the past. If Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia has indicated that it would not simply accept permanent strategic inferiority. That statement matters because Saudi Arabia has something Iran has struggled with for decades: money, international partnerships, and access to advanced technology. Saudi Arabia could potentially develop a sophisticated civilian nuclear infrastructure, and civilian nuclear infrastructure is not automatically a weapons program. That's an important distinction. Nuclear power is not the same thing as a nuclear bomb, but the same scientific ecosystem engineers, nuclear scientists, fuel cycle knowledge, research facilities, and industrial infrastructure can become strategically significant if a government later decides to change direction. And that is why the Iranian war could have consequences far beyond Iran itself. Because governments don't only study what their neighbors say. They study what happens to them. They ask, what happened to Libya? What happened to Iraq? What happened to Ukraine after surrendering its inherited nuclear arsenal? What happened to countries that relied on international promises instead of their own deterrent? And now they can add another question. What happened to Iran? If the lesson they take from this conflict is that a country without nuclear weapons can be attacked despite possessing a large conventional military and extensive missile defenses, then the incentive to acquire a nuclear deterrent becomes stronger. And this is where the entire logic of non-proliferation becomes incredibly complicated, because there are two competing forces. The first force says, prevent more countries from obtaining nuclear weapons. The second says, make sure countries never believe nuclear weapons are necessary for survival. You need both. If you only use pressure and threats, you may strengthen the second problem. And that is the paradox. The harder you try to convince a country that nuclear weapons are unacceptable while simultaneously demonstrating that conventional defenses cannot guarantee its survival, the more attractive nuclear deterrence can become. Now, let's look at Israel. Israel's position is fundamentally different. Israel has never publicly acknowledged possessing nuclear weapons, maintaining what is often described as a policy of nuclear ambiguity. But strategically, the existence of that ambiguity changes the regional equation. Iran sees a nuclear-capable Israel. Saudi Arabia sees Iran pursuing advanced nuclear capabilities. Turkey sees instability spreading across its neighborhood. And the United States is trying to prevent all of this from turning into an uncontrolled proliferation crisis. This is why the conflict isn't simply America versus Iran. It is a security competition involving the entire region. And there is another player who cannot be ignored: China. China's relationship with Iran has become increasingly important. China is one of Iran's major economic partners and a major buyer of Iranian energy. Beijing does not necessarily want Iran to become a nuclear-armed state, but China also has little incentive to allow Washington to completely isolate Tehran. That's a crucial distinction. Beijing can simultaneously oppose nuclear proliferation while opposing American attempts to dominate Iran's strategic choices. And Russia has its own calculations. Moscow has long maintained relationships with Tehran while also pursuing its own influence in the Middle East. So Washington isn't negotiating with one government. It is operating inside a network of competing powers. And that makes economic pressure much harder to use as a simple weapon, because sanctions work best when most of the major economic powers cooperate. If alternative trade routes exist, if alternative currencies exist, if alternative suppliers exist, if alternative diplomatic partners exist, then pressure becomes a contest of endurance. And Iran has spent decades learning how to survive under sanctions. That doesn't mean sanctions don't hurt. They do. Economic pressure can weaken governments, reduce investment, disrupt trade, and create enormous domestic hardship. But hurting an economy and changing a government's strategic calculation are two different things. And this is where the nuclear issue becomes especially dangerous, because economic pressure can produce two completely opposite outcomes. A government may say, we are suffering, we need an agreement. Or it may say, we are suffering because we don't have enough deterrence. We need to become harder to attack. Which response wins depends on what the leadership believes about the future. And after a major military confrontation, that perception can change dramatically. Now let's consider the strongest argument against the entire nuclear boomerang theory. Perhaps none of this matters. Perhaps Iran's leadership understands that acquiring a nuclear weapon would create enormous risks. It could trigger an even larger international response. It could accelerate regional proliferation. It could invite additional sanctions. It could damage relationships with countries that don't want another nuclear-armed state. And it could create enormous pressure from neighboring governments. In that scenario, Tehran might decide that maintaining a threshold capability is better than openly crossing the line. That would allow Iran to preserve technological options without formally becoming a nuclear-armed state. And honestly, that's a much more complicated and arguably more realistic possibility than simply saying Iran will build a bomb. We don't know that. And anyone claiming absolute certainty is getting ahead of the evidence. But here's what we can say. The strategic environment has changed, and when the environment changes, governments recalculate. That recalculation is what we need to watch. Because the most important signal may not be an announcement that Iran has built a weapon. It could be something much quieter, a change in nuclear doctrine, a change in language from Iranian officials, a decision to reduce cooperation with international inspectors, a decision to expand enrichment capabilities, a decision to increase stockpiles, a decision to withdraw from existing agreements, or even simply a political shift toward the argument that nuclear deterrence is necessary. Each step would tell the world that the old calculation is breaking down. And there's one institution sitting directly in the middle of this problem, the International Atomic Energy Agency. For decades, international inspectors have attempted to monitor Iran's nuclear activities and provide the outside world with information about what Tehran is doing. But inspections only work when inspectors have access. And access depends on cooperation. If the relationship between Iran and international inspectors deteriorates, the world faces a terrible information problem. You don't necessarily know that Iran is building a bomb. You also don't know that it isn't. And uncertainty itself can become destabilizing, because when governments cannot see what their adversary is doing, they begin planning for the worst-case scenario. Saudi Arabia plans for an Iranian bomb. Israel plans for an Iranian bomb. The United States plans for an Iranian bomb. Iran then sees those preparations and concludes that everyone is preparing to attack it. And suddenly, each side's defensive behavior looks offensive to the other side. That's the classic security dilemma. Everyone claims they're acting defensively, but collectively, everyone makes the situation more dangerous. And this is where the story connects back to America's original objective. If the goal was genuinely to prevent a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, then military action cannot be judged only by how much physical damage it caused. It has to be judged by what happens to the incentives afterward. Did Iran become less interested in nuclear deterrence, or more interested? Did Saudi Arabia become less concerned, or more concerned? Did the region become more stable? Or did every government begin asking what it needs to survive the next war? Because that's the metric that ultimately matters. And here's the uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the most important battlefield isn't Iran's nuclear facilities at all. Maybe it's the minds of the governments watching the war, because every capital in the region is studying the same lesson. They're asking one question: if the next war comes, what will protect us? For some countries, the answer might be alliances. For others, missile defenses. For others, conventional military power. But if enough governments eventually decide that only nuclear weapons can provide the ultimate guarantee, then the Middle East could enter an entirely new era. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of this story. Because Iran isn't the only country whose nuclear calculation could change, Saudi Arabia has been watching. And if Riyadh begins preparing for a nuclear option, Washington could face a dilemma far more difficult than the one it faced with Tehran. Because America would suddenly have to prevent a nuclear arms race among its own partners. And in part 3, that's exactly where we're going next, the Saudi question. America's credibility, and the possibility that the war has created a regional nuclear race that Washington can no longer easily control. Now we reach the part of this story that could determine what the Middle East looks like for the next 20 years. Because even if Iran never actually builds a nuclear weapon, the idea that it might need one could be enough to change the behavior of every major power around it. And the country I want you to watch most closely is Saudi Arabia. For Washington, Saudi Arabia is supposed to be part of the solution, but there is a potential contradiction hiding underneath that relationship. America wants to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, At the same time, Saudi Arabia has repeatedly signaled that it cannot accept a permanent Iranian nuclear advantage. And that creates a strategic dilemma. Imagine Riyadh watching this entire conflict unfold. Iran is attacked. Iran's military infrastructure is targeted. Iran's nuclear capabilities become the center of an international confrontation, and then Iranian officials begin discussing whether nuclear deterrence is necessary for survival. Saudi policymakers don't need to agree with Iran. They simply need to understand the logic. If nuclear capability makes a country harder to attack, then every rival has an incentive to consider acquiring the same capability. This is how arms races begin, not because everyone suddenly wants nuclear weapons, but because nobody wants to be the only major power that doesn't have them. And that distinction is incredibly important, because Saudi Arabia doesn't necessarily need to announce, "We are building a bomb." It could begin with something much more subtle: expanding civilian nuclear infrastructure, training more nuclear scientists, developing domestic fuel cycle expertise, building partnerships with foreign nuclear powers, creating the industrial capacity that could eventually support a weapons option. Officially, every one of those activities could remain civilian. Strategically, however, they could create what analysts sometimes call nuclear latency, the ability to move toward a weapon much faster if the political decision is eventually made. And that would put Washington in an extremely uncomfortable position, because the United States has spent decades telling its allies, "We will protect you." But the more countries question whether American protection is permanent, the more attractive independent deterrence becomes. This is the credibility problem. An alliance is not just about military equipment, it is about belief. Your ally has to believe that if the worst happens, you will actually show up. And after a major conflict involving Iran, every government in the region is reassessing that assumption, because alliances can change, presidents change, administrations change, American priorities change, but nuclear weapons remain. That is why some governments view nuclear deterrence as the ultimate insurance policy, and Washington understands this. That's precisely why any Saudi nuclear cooperation with the United States becomes strategically significant. Civilian nuclear cooperation is not inherently dangerous. Nuclear power can provide electricity, diversify energy systems, and support economic development, but the political conditions attached to nuclear cooperation matter enormously. If Saudi Arabia believes it needs a domestic nuclear capability partly because of Iran, then Washington has to balance two objectives: give Saudi Arabia enough capability and reassurance to keep it inside the American security system without giving it the tools or incentives to eventually pursue an independent nuclear deterrent. That balancing act becomes much harder if Saudi Arabia concludes that American guarantees are temporary. And then there is another problem: Israel. Israel views Iran's nuclear ambitions as an existential threat. Iran views Israel as a major military adversary. Saudi Arabia wants protection from Iran, but also has its own regional interests, and the United States is trying to keep all three relationships functioning simultaneously. That's an incredibly difficult triangle, because actions taken to make one country feel safer can make another feel more threatened. Suppose Washington strengthens Saudi Arabia. Iran sees a stronger American-backed rival. Iran responds by increasing its military capabilities. Israel sees that increase and demands more support. Washington strengthens Israel. Iran interprets that as confirmation that it needs stronger deterrence. And around the cycle goes. Nobody has to deliberately want a regional arms race. The system itself can produce one. This is why the concept of a security dilemma matters so much here. A country can take an action because it feels threatened. Its rival sees that action as preparation for aggression. The rival responds defensively. The first country then sees the response as proof that its fears were justified. And suddenly both sides are more heavily armed than they were before. Now, add nuclear weapons to that equation. The margin for error becomes dramatically smaller because conventional military mistakes can be catastrophic. Nuclear mistakes can be irreversible, and that is why the Iranian question matters so much. The real danger isn't necessarily that Iran wakes up one morning and announces, "We have a nuclear bomb." The greater danger could be a gradual breakdown of the assumptions that prevented countries from wanting one. First, Iran concludes it needs deterrence. Then Saudi Arabia concludes it needs a counterweight. Then Turkey begins reconsidering its own strategic position. Then Israel increases its readiness. Then the United States deploys more forces. And every government says, we are only responding. That is how a region can become much more dangerous without anyone formally declaring a nuclear arms race. But there is still another possibility, and this is where we need to be fair. The war could eventually produce the opposite result. Iran could conclude that the economic and military costs of confrontation are simply too high. Washington could conclude that indefinite pressure isn't sustainable. European governments could push for a new diplomatic framework. Regional powers could pressure Tehran and Washington simultaneously, and eventually everyone could decide that some form of agreement is better than continuing the escalation. That possibility should not be dismissed. In fact, diplomacy may still be the only mechanism capable of solving the underlying problem. Because there is a fundamental difference between destroying nuclear infrastructure and resolving the political reasons a country wants nuclear deterrence. Bombing facilities can delay a program. It cannot permanently eliminate scientific knowledge. It cannot erase engineers. It cannot erase strategic fear. And it cannot guarantee that another government won't rebuild the program somewhere else. Only a political settlement can address those underlying incentives. But political settlements require something even more difficult, trust. And trust is exactly what this conflict has damaged. Iran has less reason to trust American promises. Washington has less reason to trust Iranian assurances. Israel has less confidence in international restrictions. Saudi Arabia is watching both sides. And Europe is increasingly concerned that another major escalation could send energy prices, migration pressures, and regional instability across its own borders. So the consequences don't stop at the Middle East. This is where the European dimension becomes important. Europe doesn't want another nuclear crisis on its doorstep. It doesn't want a prolonged war disrupting energy markets. And it certainly doesn't want Iran becoming more closely aligned with Russia and China, because Western pressure leaves Tehran with fewer alternatives. From Europe's perspective, there is a dangerous possibility. The more isolated Iran becomes from the West, the more strategically dependent it becomes on non-Western powers. And that could reshape the balance of power for decades. China can provide economic relationships. Russia can provide military and technological partnerships. Regional countries can provide alternative trade routes, and Iran can continue developing its own domestic capabilities. That means maximum pressure may not necessarily produce capitulation. It could instead produce strategic independence. And this brings us back to the title of this entire story. What was America's nuclear war really about? If the answer is simply stopping Iran from building a nuclear weapon, then we have to evaluate whether the strategy actually reduces Iran's incentive to pursue one. But if the war increases that incentive, then something has gone badly wrong. And if the war was actually about something broader, regional dominance, alliance structures, Israeli security, energy routes, or preventing Iran from becoming the dominant power in the Gulf, then the nuclear issue may have been only one part of a much larger geopolitical struggle. We have to be careful here. There is no single piece of evidence that proves one hidden master plan. Geopolitical events rarely work that neatly. Governments have competing agencies. Politicians have different objectives. Military planners have different priorities. And strategies evolve when circumstances change. But we can evaluate outcomes. And the outcome we need to watch is simple. Does Iran become less interested in nuclear deterrence or more? That's the test. Not the speeches, not the slogans, not the dramatic headlines. The strategic behavior. Watch Iran's nuclear doctrine. Watch its cooperation with international inspectors. Watch its enrichment decisions. Watch Saudi Arabia's nuclear partnerships. Watch Turkey. Watch Israel. And watch Washington's security guarantees. Because these signals will tell us whether the conflict is moving toward containment or toward proliferation. And there is one final irony. America may have entered this confrontation trying to prevent a nuclear threshold from becoming permanent. But if the countries watching the conflict conclude that only nuclear weapons guarantee survival, then the war could leave behind something far more dangerous than the program it was designed to stop. A new regional nuclear logic. That is the real nuclear domino. And once the first country decides that the safest way to survive is to become impossible to destroy, every country around it has to reconsider its own survival strategy. So the biggest question isn't whether Iran has already decided to build a bomb. We don't have enough evidence to say that with certainty. The bigger question is whether the war has changed the calculation inside Tehran and inside every other capital watching from the sidelines. Because if it has, then this conflict isn't ending when the missiles stop. It is only entering its next phase, and the decisions made in that next phase could determine whether the Middle East moves toward a new diplomatic equilibrium or toward a nuclear arms race that nobody intended to start. And that is why Iran's next nuclear decision may matter far more than the last missile fired,